Welcome to the Chamber's Government Affairs Forum featuring Congressman Richard Neal. I'm Carolyn Ryan, the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Chamber. Our CEO, who I'm filling in for today, Jim Rooney, is currently at the White House having a meeting with President Biden. He's there in recognition of our leadership in workforce and talent policy, so he sends his regrets to everybody here. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and welcome Congressman Neal, Chair of the House Ways and Means Committee and a friend of the Chamber. We have a great audience ready to hear from Chairman Neal, but first join me in recognizing and thanking any of our elected leaders who are in the room. I also want to just take a couple minutes and highlight some of our upcoming events of interest at the Chamber. On November 17th from 3:45 to 6 p.m., we're hosting our next Women's Network event, Women Leading Construction and Real Estate Development. And on December 7th from 10 to 11 a.m., we'll host our annual Economic Outlook Breakfast. You can find out more and register for all these events at bostonchamber.com. And don't forget to follow and tag our new public policy Twitter account at GBCC Policy in your post this morning. We're almost ready to welcome Congressman Neal, but before we do, I'd like to thank our longtime government affairs sponsor, Bank of America. Now I'm pleased to turn it over to Mihal Chamberlain, President of Bank of America, to introduce Congressman Neal. Later, Mihal will join the Congressman back on stage for the Q&A portion.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here amongst fellow friends, colleagues, and teammates for our final Government Affairs Forum of 2022. Hard to believe with the weather outside, it's early November. But on behalf of Bank of America and our almost 4,500 teammates here in Massachusetts, I want to give a big thank you to Carolyn, Jim Rooney, and the entire Chamber team for their partnership in the Government Affairs Forum meetings. They've been a great success, and we look forward to carrying on the tradition in 23. And as business leaders in our community here, the opportunity to hear from government officials about the matters affecting our state and city are key to understanding how we can make Greater Boston, Massachusetts a better place to work and to live. And it's my honor today to be able to introduce the chairman, Richard Neal, our keynote speaker. Chairman Neal has been leading voice at both the federal and state level, using his wealth of knowledge and experience to advocate on behalf of the country and the residents of Massachusetts. After being elected to the House of Representatives in 1988, Chairman Neal spent his first 2 terms in office in the House Banking Committee, before joining the House Ways and Means Committee in 1993, where he spent his time in office working tirelessly for the American people. In 2019, he was elected by his peers to the esteemed position of Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, becoming the first time since 1875 that a representative from the Bay State had done so. With Chairman Neal's help, the American people were able to receive much-needed aid during the COVID-19 pandemic through the passing of both the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act. And most recently, Chairman Neal helped shepherd the Inflation Reduction Act through enactment. In addition to serving in Congress, Chairman Neal also is a longtime guest lecturer at UMass Amherst and a recipient of many awards and accolades. It's always a special honor to have the chairman with us for these events, and we thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to do so. So without further ado, please welcome Chairman Richard Neal to the stage.
Thanks, Mihal, for that very generous introduction, and thanks to the Boston Chamber. You're known by your esteemed reputation and well-regarded everywhere, and it's always a pleasure for a member of Congress, I think, to have a chance to speak to so many individuals who have broad influence on public and private events across our country. So beyond the fact that I'm delighted to be with you, it's also, I think, an opportunity to speak about the success that you've had here in Boston, where the ecosystem of investment and venture capital and your biggest industry, which people really don't pay a lot of, and that's Medicare spending, A lot of people don't realize what Medicare means to this city, but the hospitals, which are arguably the best in the world, as is Bay State Medical and UMass in Worcester and at Berkshire Medical, but their money overwhelmingly comes from Medicare. And when you add Medicaid to it, in some cases, in Holyoke or in a place like Springfield with the Sisters of Providence, it's 80% of their revenue. And here with these great hospitals, people tend not to associate Medicare in terms of the investment, but it employs tens of thousands of people, coupled with the fact that it has an enormous influence on what is known as graduate medical education, GME, and that's how we train our doctors. So if you've got a medical issue anywhere in the world, you're likely to find this address as the one that you desire. No question about that. So let me just retrace some events, because I think it's important on occasions like this. I'm going to leave room for you to ask a lot of questions. So remember what the Ways and Means Committee does. And the Ways and Means Committee is responsible for all tax matters, because the Constitution suggests that all tax issues have to originate in the House of Representatives, and then in the House of Representatives, it's in the Ways and Means Committee. So we do all tax, trade, tariffs, which are tax-related, Medicare, Social Security, management of the public debt, not to mention pensions, and welfare, and the tax portion of Medicaid. We have been able, based upon a date that all of you are going to remember, at least after I remind you of it, on March 11th of 2020, Dr. Fauci issued his warning. March 11th, 2020. By April of 2020, as Michal had noted, we lost 22 million jobs in America. 22 million jobs. So 2.5 years later, every job has been returned, and as the Labor Department reported 2 days ago, 10.7 million jobs every day go unanswered in America. So labor participation rates have held fairly steady, decline in productivity, which I think has something to do with remote visitations to the workplace. But the unemployment rate is 3.5% nationally, and in Massachusetts, I think between 3.5% and 3.7%. So the economy, in the sense of employment and upward pressure on wages for the first time in a long time, it's performing pretty well. The challenge, as we know, and we have to understand it, is the issue of inflation. Overwhelmingly, the issue of inflation is still driven by what Putin has done in Ukraine. It's also heavily influenced by the reaction to COVID in China. But it is not taken us away from the fundamental issue of supply and demand. Now, some of the supply chains are lightening up a bit. Even during the last month, you can see what's happening. I was caught with some statistical data the other day that the average used car now in America goes at $31,000. So that's part of the supply and demand issue. But also, one of the things we did with the CHIPS Act, which was a pretty Herculean piece of legislation, and the Ways and Means Committee wrote a lot of it, one of the things that we did with the CHIPS Act was to make us internationally competitive again. Chips are manufactured in South Korea, Taiwan, and China is trying very hard to catch up with us. But I think the investment that we've made now in chips is going to have a long-term benefit. So let me just take you through, because I think that sometimes amnesia settles in because media today, they cover more conflict. That's not a put-down, it's, as much as it is, it's an acknowledgement that people look for news that agree with them, as opposed to looking for news that might be discerning. So here's what we've done. Michal noted, the CARES Act. Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin and I, over 8 days in her office, we negotiated that legislation. The CARES Act saved the American economy. It was, again, about supply and demand, putting money into the hands and pockets of people at the lower end of the economic spectrum who really needed it. The child credit, the dependent care credit, all of those were assembled. The supplemental checks that were sent out, where did they go? We went to community banks, we went to credit unions, and we went to CDFIs because they would know the credit history of the person who needed it. People at the top, they have enough saved income. People at the bottom, they spend the money. The CARES Act was a really important piece of legislation. But not to be outdone, we did the HEROES Act. How about the infrastructure bill? Is there a city in America that has done better with infrastructure than the city of Boston? I mean, what happened with the Big Dig, despite some of the claims that we legitimately have in the central and western part of the state as to how many initiatives were postponed or delayed as the Big Dig began to usurp investment at the public level, in the federal level. But when you look at that waterfront today, you can relate that to the Big Dig. How about saving the Postal Service by changing the Medicare formula? We did that in the Ways and Means Committee. I noted earlier the CHIPS Act. How about the idea of the President's Inflation Reduction Act? For those of you who do renewable energy, there are $369 billion in that legislation of tax incentives, which I'm going to be discussing later on in Cambridge today, that will augment all of the things that we wanted to do with reducing global warming. Now, let me just say this to you candidly. In the Ways and Means Committee, we do very measured pieces of legislation. And by and large, the people that get to serve on the Ways and Means Committee are pretty measured in their public responses. We tend not to do a lot of emotion because we are tasked with doing big things. And I say that to the members of the committee all of the time. Think through what you're going to say. So on the renewable front, we have continued to have a very loud conversation in America about the role of climate change. It's happening. You can't deny it. But I think what we can do is use the tax code to incent people to make the necessary investments that will move us away from dependence on the fossil fuel industry. And I think that's the way to proceed. So what we did in this legislation, and I want to thank two people you might not remember after this morning, Mike Thompson from California and Earl Blumenauer from Oregon. What a job they did in the committee on the issue of those tax incentives. Hydrogen, alternative energies, you name it. It's all packaged in there, and I'm hoping that if you ever have questions on it, I have a tax staff that can tell you on the phone without going to look what that legislation looks like. The multi-employer pension plans. Look what that did to Local 25 in South Boston. And it wasn't just a union-related job, and I insisted that we include it in the legislation. Here's what the committee assignment means in being chairman of the committee. To sit in the Oval Office with the president, Joe Biden, and talk about what the legislation is going to look like, and to say to him, Mr. President, I'm putting that multi-employer legislation in your bill. And to have the president say, I agree with you. So 3 million people can now sleep at night. They didn't do anything wrong with their pensions. They played by the rules, but the whole multi-employer issue of how the burden and responsibility was shared just didn't work anymore. What worked in the 50s and the 60s just didn't work anymore economically. How about the Secure Act? And Secure Now 2.0, which I anticipate we will get over the finish line in a lame duck session. Somebody mentioned to me the other night at an event I was at, they said, well, do you think you can get this done in a lame? Oh, no, I know. I was at the convention, got together with the medical device industry a few days back in Boston. And a fellow said to me, do you think you can get some of these big things done with the tax extenders and other issues at the end of the session? So I related to him, I said, well, here's the way to think of the lame duck session and many of these issues. For those of you who remember the movie Waking Ned Devine, when they stare at the corpse and say, nothing's more alive than when it's dead. So everybody that thinks that those issues are dead, do a reset. We're going to revisit a lot of them, I can assure you of that. And one of the last issues as well that I'm really proud of, I negotiated the USMCA, the largest hemispheric trade agreement in the history of the world. It drew little attention in Boston, drew a lot of attention in other places across the country. This is a trade-related city. 1/3 of the economy here is trade-related. The airport, the Port of Boston, rail, you name it. It's here. But with USMCA, we got 195 Democrats to vote for a trade agreement and 194 Republicans. Despite all the talk, and the former U.S. Trade Representative, Bob Lighthizer, a Republican, we negotiated that legislation day after day for months until we found an agreement. And a reporter from the New York Times said to me, well, Mr. Chairman, when did you know you were going to get an agreement with the administration? I said, when I found out that Bob Lighthizer worked for Bob Dole. The two of us would come from the same school. We're going to get an agreement. We're going to stay in that room until we get one. And we did it. And I take great satisfaction in the fact people who had never voted for a trade agreement in America, their time in career, in Washington voted for USMCA. We dealt with mental health issues. Incentives in the legislation that we put together also addresses what we're all witnessing now, particularly for a lot of juveniles. They were isolated for 2 years. We're going to have to do a lot of catch-up, but certainly primary education for sure. And the committee also addressed the issue of Ukraine. We took away permanent normal trading relations from Russia, which, by the way, earned me I am banned from Russia for the rest of my life. They've announced that. I was thinking of going to Finland, but I'm liable not to get too close to the border. The attacks, unprovoked, on the Ukrainian people mean we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, and Joe Biden has handled that in the right way. And I think that's an essential understanding of what we're talking about. Two other issues that don't draw a lot of attention, but they should. It's not only the investments that come, as I noted, from Medicare and Medicaid in Massachusetts, but the role of the NIH and protecting NIH. We're going to find a cure for cancer? NIH is going to find the cure for cancer. That budget now is headed toward $40 billion, and even though Massachusetts is about the 14th largest state in the country, we're the second largest recipient of NIH dollars. Why? Because of the hospitals we have in the state, because of the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare system that we have here. And the other thing you should be proud of, every child in Massachusetts has health insurance. 97% of the adults in Massachusetts, and through those long hours of writing the Affordable Care Act, I kept citing the example that Massachusetts had established. So I bring those to your attention because, again, in the din of public debate with an election coming up next Tuesday, it's been pretty hard sometimes to shout over the national debate, the national conversation. And I would just let you in on a secret, if you can keep it amongst us. The quality of the national conversation is not about to get much better in the next week. I mean, this is when everything breaks through. So as I look to offer a prediction on where we might be heading, I think that the candidates that we have, of which I recruited a lot of them, you should know, they're really good candidates. They tend to represent purple districts. But even with the polling that I've looked at, and I say to the staff, by the way, because the polling, as you know, there are now more pollsters and more consultants than there are candidates. So I say to my staff, go get a poll that agrees with us. Make me feel good for the next couple of hours. And even with the polling that you see right now, it's in a primary or an off-year election, the question still is who shows? Where's the energy level? And the last point that I would make on this, maybe not the last point, but close to the last point, the polling was off in 2016, it was really off in 2018, and it was really off in 2020. And part of the problem that we have is that getting people to stay with the pollster on the phone is really hard. So Republicans will argue they understate Republican votes, and young people won't stay on the call. The retired will stay on a landline, right? Only too happy to let you know what they think. And that's why, by the way, in recent days, Joe Biden has gone back to Social Security and Medicare. And he's right about it, absolutely right about it. So I think that when you look at some of the polling data that we've seen, it doesn't measure the quality of our candidates. I likely will be in New Hampshire next week, and I'm certainly scheduled to be in Ohio this weekend to help out a couple of our candidates, and Tim Ryan, who's run a spectacular campaign in Ohio as well. But if you look at some of these candidates in these districts, they're really tough, but they're ahead. So last Monday morning, just by way of anecdote, last Monday morning, of course, the New York Times runs that headline, which I had not seen the night before, so they saved it for reason. And it said, you know, the economic winds were tilting against us. But then I went to 538 with Nate Silver, which many of us do, and he's made some errors too. But I went to 538 with Nate Silver, and he took the top 12 House races in the country, and we were either ahead or even in all of them. So these candidates, you know, it's one thing to represent a district that's 70% Democratic. It's another thing to represent a district that's 40% Democratic and 40% Republican, and then on to the independent voters. And the staggering consequence of what I've just described is that here in Massachusetts, I hope that you'd have this as a takeaway number, 58% of the voters in Massachusetts are now independents. Well, 32% are Democrats and 9% or so are Republicans. So you have a Republican governor who's pretty popular and really been good to work with. You should know that. When I call him, he responds. After all the money he has received, that would be a good idea. But my point is that the 495 suburbs, it's where he's wildly popular. And that's where these races are overwhelmingly decided. Last point. So I'm going to take the question later on. Been primed for it, but I thought I would use this opportunity as well. You have the issue of the MBTA, and it really remains a very stubborn problem. We all watch across the state when you have a bad snowstorm, the people are stranded. Massachusetts is receiving $9 billion in infrastructure spending. Massachusetts is receiving billions more in the Inflation Reduction Act. The state right now can afford what we want in central and western Massachusetts, improved passenger service on rail. Now, Governor Baker agrees with me on this. He has assured me that by the end of his term, he is going to sign the necessary documents. And Maura Healey, I just say that not as, she's my candidate, you should know that, but Maura Healey has assured me that it's a priority for her as well. So, when Bostonians rush to the MBTA for improved service, I want the capital region to have a first-class transit system, but the rest of us across the state help to pay for it, the sales tax. We want Worcester West, for real. Yeah. Thank you. The people from Springfield and Pittsfield just weighed in. And the Shays will weigh in on that. They agree with us on that. But that's, my point is that this, with $9 billion, there are a lot of things that you can do. And I hope that the people of Boston will be as open to East-West Rail as we have been with the sales tax across the state for getting this transportation system straightened out in the city of Boston. You have a marvelous story to tell, but we've got a pretty good story to tell, too, in central and western Massachusetts. I spent a lot of time last week in western Mass in the Berkshires. One of the things you find out about the Berkshires, they think Springfield is central Massachusetts. And no, Worcester is central Massachusetts. But my point is that in engaging these conversations out there, we think that it would take some of the pressure off of housing costs in Boston as well. There are a lot of people in Boston living in homes that cost $1 million that in other parts of the state would cost $400,000. And you get a lot of house, by the way. And so I use those as two vivid examples. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Mihal, are you going to manage that? But most importantly, thanks. This is a great story to tell.
All right, I have a few questions, but please feel free to raise your hand, and as I get into it, we'd love to hear from the crowd. But first of all, Chairman, thank you again for being with us this morning, and thank you for representing us so well and admirably in Washington. My first question, you talked a bit about everything that your team got done with a lot of help in Washington during the pandemic, and I think we all agree it put us in a much better situation than we could have been. I guess my question is, now that we're getting further away from the pandemic, can you talk a little bit about the temperature, everything we read in terms of things getting more polarized in Washington, the ability to get things done when there's not a crisis? Can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are going forward on that question?
The polarization that we're all witnessing didn't start 4 years ago or 5 years ago. This has been ongoing. A lot of academicians have indicated that it starts with Pat Buchanan's campaign for president 3 times. And some would argue it goes back to the early 60s when Senator Goldwater and others, they pushed out a lot of what we would have considered to be the real fringe at that time. But they begin to reemerge. And my own argument is that social media amplifies conflict. They find each other. And I hope that we can all agree in this room with some empathy for Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi as to what happened in that home last week. Many members of Congress we choose not to talk about this. We've all had some significant events at our homes now. And swatting and threats are not unusual. So I think that social media, again, as I noted, it not only amplifies conflict, it aggregates conflict. And how many times in our own lives do you look at something and say, wow, that's unbelievable, and 2 days later say, how could I have even thought that? And I also think that cable news, they're really not interested in a lot of solutions. You will never see me on many of those shows. I mean, we have a very important job. I'll do the business shows in the afternoon because they're not loaded with conflict. It's more about looking at GDP as we did last week, 2.7% increase. I'll comment on the Federal Reserve. I don't tell Jay Powell what interest rates should be, but I try to probe his thinking on where we are. And as you know, the Federal Reserve Board is going to meet today. It's not what he telegraphs that he's going to do. It's the press conference afterwards that gets people going. And so the market had a pretty good week last week, largely because of a lot of good news. But he has again telegraphed where he's headed. I just don't know what he'll say in the press conference afterwards. So that's newsworthy. But the point that I'm trying to make on that is there was a time when the Federal Reserve chairperson would report to the committee on their findings. The minute they used the key word, reporters would jump out of their seats and run to the pay station phones in the lobby. Now, they put it out without context. And it moves markets very quickly. When I became chairman of the committee, there's a woman I don't expect you to remember. Some of you in the tax world would remember her. She worked for Mr. Rostenkowski, who was the chairman when I joined the committee. And her name is Janice Mays. She knows that tax code better than anybody on earth. And she said to me when I took the job, she said, Mr. Chairman, just remember something. There are 4 or 5 jobs in Washington that move markets. You've got one of them. That's why I avoid emotion and commenting on issues that I shouldn't comment on.
All right, well, on that note, we see what the Fed is trying to do here. You talked a little bit about the labor market and the tightness in the labor market. I know a lot of people that head up companies here in this room can attest that attracting and retaining talent is one of the most challenging things we all encounter every day with wage inflation and with unemployment, as you noted, in the mid-3s. I guess my question is, as the Fed continues to tighten to try and curb inflation, ultimately slowing the economy, what's your thought in terms of making sure that Massachusetts comes out of this in a very, as one of the more competitive states where companies want to do business and people want to go to work here in Massachusetts?
Well, we have one kind of built-in, a series actually of kind of built-in advantages, and seldom is there really a recession in healthcare. Seldom is there really a recession in education. And I'm always amazed at how underreported venture capital is, looking for that next big winner in Massachusetts. I mean, this area is so well positioned on all of those issues. But the other attending problem, Mihal, that we have in America, never mind in Massachusetts, it's skill set. So let me give you an example. In Pittsfield, Massachusetts, General Dynamics, they employ about 1,300 people. A lot of them from Rensselaer, UMass Engineering, Western New England, WPI. Tomorrow, they would hire 300 people. I was at Warren Pump last week. A lot of you don't necessarily know that where Warren Pump is. It's in this beautiful little bucolic town in southern Worcester County. They have 150 jobs in manufacturing right now. Walked out the other day after celebrating their 125th anniversary. The manager says to me, I'd hire 20 tomorrow. Everywhere you go, there are homemade signs in the windows. But the challenge is part of it is the skill set. So we've got a community college system in Massachusetts that's spectacular. And I think that we need to direct many of those investments we make in those students toward available job opportunities. Cybersecurity is going to be a big opportunity for this state because the state has a superlative reputation for research. So you consider that all of these jobs that go, my favorite one, by the way, is the PVTA, the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority in Springfield. Covers the college towns and all. It's pretty neat. There's a sign on top of the building that's been there for 2 years. Mechanics want it. Those jobs pay $80,000 a year. And trying to connect the community colleges with those jobs is really going to be essential for us. And some of it might be certificate programs, but we keep talking about globalization, which is going to change radically. We're not going away from globalization, but how we approach it is going to change. Too many people have been left behind. So I think there's an opportunity there with the community college system, and they're positioned everywhere across the state. And I was out to Berkshire Community College last week for their nursing program to help them out with an earmark. And at Berkshire Community College and their nursing program, all of those students, they're going to go to work at Berkshire Medical Center. It's a great place to live in the Berkshires if you have a good job. And I call attention to that because not only was Berkshire Community College the first one in the state, but a little bit of history for all of you. Foster Ferkalow was the governor who heavily influenced the development of community college. He was from Springfield. And I eulogized him on the House floor after he died, but he'd gone to Yale and Yale Law School. But he thought there needed to be a role for the first generation, the children and grandchildren of immigrants, get a chance. We need to take advantage of this community college system we have for the skill set purposes. The economy really needs them. The governor and I always talk about labor participation rates. I know that's sort of a wonky thing, but wow, is it important. And there are too many people sitting on the sidelines.
Was it 62%?
Yeah, 62.3%, yeah.
Yeah, I think we'd agree on the community college front. I know the Chamber's been active with partnering with Accenture and others in terms of trying to figure out how we can get more of a talent pool out of the community colleges. So more to come on that. That's something that, as a working group, we're involved with. Any questions from the audience? I have others, but Paul, I think we have a mic coming. Just give it 1 second, please.
Thank you very much. Paul Paravano from MIT. Mr. Chairman, what a treat to have you here. Thank you for the millions of ways you've served the people of Massachusetts. Your comment about Senator Goldwater makes me think, I don't know, it just popped right back into my head. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. I don't know if I have that right, but I think that's what he said. My question, and I hope you don't mind my asking this, because I'm really not asking you for how to vote, but since I trust your wisdom and experience and knowledge about many things, what are the right questions to ask oneself next week when we think about how to vote on question 1?
Well, let me start by qualifying my comments as one who's done tax work for now 34 years and now runs the committee that does tax work. I wish there was a different avenue. Referendum questions tend to be yes or no. Most legislative life is not yes or no. That's one of the challenges you have with legislative life. And you sit in a room and you've got somebody there who you're down to that last vote you need, and they say something to you that's really off script, and you say to yourself, I can't believe they just said that. And then you say, I need their vote. So all of a sudden, what was on the fringe has become mainstream as you're looking for that last vote. So on the question, let me also say something else. I authored legislation that said that the top earners in America should be paying 39.6%. Those are Bill Clinton rates. The economy flourished. Those are Obama rates. The economy held up. I think the cap gains rate ought to be at about 28%. I think we ought to do something on the investment side for people that take these risks. So I think that the wealthy in America are not paying as much as they should be paying on the individual side. On the corporate side, the legislation called for a corporate rate of 26%. That was down from 35. You should know whose advice I sought on that, including Jack Lew and Bob Rubin and others. We felt that the corporate rate, once you take advantage of exclusions, preferences, and deductions in the code, still needed a boost to keep us internationally competitive. So I think that without instructing anybody who to vote for, how to vote on that referendum question, I think you ought to be just discerning. And the other question I think on it is, can we guarantee that it's going to go to education and infrastructure? And for those of us in the western part of the state, if it's going infrastructure, we want in on that infrastructure expenditure. It's a great question. I haven't really settled in on a lot of these questions. I haven't had a chance. I've been running all over the country. But I do think my tax bill passed the House of Representatives. It was thwarted in the Senate. The problem we had in the Senate was Senator Gillibrand, she disagreed with me on the tax rates, but she agreed with me on the incentives. Joe Manchin agreed with me on the tax rates, but disagreed with me on the incentives. And when you need one vote, we couldn't get it. Yeah, so I think it was a responsible plan, and it augurs, you go back to the Clinton arguments, which, by the way, I would just say this to you, and feel free to challenge me. It's still the best economy in the history of America, the last 6 years. When you talk about 22 million jobs, upward pressure on wages, when you consider what happened in those years to minority Americans, whose salaries actually went up and poverty went down. And remember, because social spending is formulaic in America, food stamps in particular, if everybody's got a job, they're paying more in federal taxes. So we balanced the budget 4 times in Clinton's last 5 years. So if you're spending more, if people are working, they're paying more in federal tax, and they need less social spending. So I submit that to you, and those were rates, Paul, that were 39.6, yeah.
Other questions from the crowd?
Yes.
In the back.
This better be a softball.
It's a softball. No, it's not really. Congressman, you talk about unemployment, the employment rate, the lack of folks looking for work. The answer has been for the last 2 centuries immigration.
Yeah.
That's where our workforce has always come from. And it's not here now. Simple softball. How do you solve immigration, Rich?
Well, I'm not going to be defensive about it because my grandparents were immigrants. And you know how much they loved America. And just had a great reunion in County Down last summer. But the reminder here that we need immigrants. The economy needs immigrants. So I've been less ostracizing in the argument and more about the reality of it. Might be a little bit of a trespass, but fertility rates in America are at 1.8% for women. Just like this. And the argument over immigration, I think, should be certainly skill set. I mean, again, what city has done better in America because of MIT and Harvard and Tufts and all of these schools, Boston College, Boston, you go right across in Western Massachusetts. I was on the Board of Trustees for 10 years at Mount Holyoke College. Teaching UMass. I know what this means. And I think it's a horrific mistake to welcome these students to America, give them a great degree, and then send them back. We should keep them here. And I worry because the argument now, because of the way we talk to each other across the country, the argument is about open borders. And I am not for open borders. You should know that. You need to know who's in the country. That's part of our responsibility at the federal level. But I also think that we can move off of the polarization and the anger that is expressed over the role that immigration plays. It would help to solve the productivity issue. It would help to solve labor participation rates, and we need them. And I think that I'm open to guest passes for day workers. You know, people that really don't want to take American citizenship, but they want to work here. They want day passes in the Southwest, fine. There's an enormous opportunity for them. I also would point out that George Bush Jr., he was all in on immigration. And by the way, all of his motives were not, just about employment. He had received 37% of the Hispanic vote in Texas the second time he ran for governor. So he was into, these could be good voters for his side. But look what happened to him in his own party. So I've been part of a couple of good immigration bills, but I'm a believer in the role that immigration plays. The story in America, Jim, is never as pristine as some would have you believe about immigration. You know, this idea that was postulated that there was a welcoming committee at the dock, not true. So we've always, it's been a testy argument about immigration. So I just would say for those of you who follow economics hourly, we need them. And we've got to get this issue behind us. I hope Joe Biden can find an agreement. I think the Republicans have become, it's not all the Republican Party, by the way. It's a wing of the Republican Party that I think that Pat Buchanan made famous in his 3 presidential races, because the Republicans used to be as open to immigration as Democrats were.
Other questions? I have another one I can ask. Yeah, so Congress faces a funding deadline in December. I'm just wondering if you can update us on how those conversations around appropriations and others are progressing.
Well, there's considerable demagoguery around this issue, as you've noticed. Let me just explain something about the national debt. There's a difference between deficits and debt, and we manage the debt in the committee. The debt is the accumulation of deficits. The deficit is the annual cost that we run up. Sometimes revenue outpaces what we're borrowing, and other times it doesn't. But clearly, I thought there was good news for Biden 3 weeks ago. He was telling the truth about what had happened. But there's another attending issue, as you know, and that is many people see raising the national debt as a perilous vote. Here's what I want you to think of. The national debt is not an argument about new spending. The national debt argument is about what we've already spent. So you know something about the credit card business. It's not what we're going to put on the credit card, it's what's already on the credit card. And so people that celebrate the CARES Act and the rescue package and the infrastructure bill, and now they're not going to vote to raise the national debt, I think it's sheer demagoguery. And the problem we've got is we can pass it in the House. It's the responsible position. But I do look kindly back. I'm just going to reference again that part of the issue that I used a bit ago. Remember that clock in Times Square or in New York that chronicled the size of the national debt? It was turned off during Clinton's years. And Alan Greenspan says you're paying down the debt too quickly. That's a long way from where we are now. But I think if you're willing to vote to spend $1, you've got to be willing to vote to pay for it. And you can tell I'm dating myself with this conversation. It was fairly harmonious at one time.
Any other questions from the crowd?
Yeah, please. Right over here.
On the far left here.
Mr. Chairman, nice to see you. Megan Greeley with Chartwell Strategy Group. I was going to ask you about Secure 2.0, but you've already given me a rosy outlook, so I don't want to push too hard on that. But I would love to know what, if we see either Republican control of the House and an unknown Senate, what are some of the issues you think we can expect progress on? What are the topics where there's some agreement for some bipartisan action?
Well, I think we could reopen the trade discussions. I think that European Union, Kenya, India, those come to mind. I think we might be able to make some advancement on those sorts of arguments, understanding there are also some huge mountains to climb there. I think that my perspective here is often a bit different, largely because I deal with facts. And you can't make this stuff up in the committee that we have. So, too many people for 25 years have gotten elected to Congress by running against Congress. So they can never be part of the solution because they're always the perennial outsider. That's a huge challenge. Once you get there, you've got problems to be solved. And I stopped voting for perfect people after my own race for the Springfield City Council 45 years ago. I never told anybody after that I was perfect. I would tell them I know how to get it done. Give us some latitude on this. So it'll be hard until you see who's gotten elected. I think most of our candidates are pretty mainstream. I don't think that's the case on the other side right now. And the 10 members of the Republican Party that voted to impeach the former president, I think 8 of them have lost. So they are likely to be replaced by somebody who's pretty harsh in their views. And I'm ever so hopeful the national conversation can calm down a bit. I'm not convinced of that. So the short answer is that you can always get legislative achievements done because there are necessities. I also hope that on the spending front, we will maintain congressionally directed spending. Article 1 of the Constitution says Congress decides spending, not presidents. When I remember that when I went to the House, Jim Wright had just become the Speaker, and he used to quote Rayburn, who had been Speaker on and off over 50 years. And they asked Rayburn, how many presidents have you served under? And Rayburn said, none. I've served with 7. That's the real answer on expenditure. Good question, Mike.
We got time for one more, which I have, but making sure no one in the audience has.
Yeah. Give it a go.
This is your chance. All right, I'll dig back into the whole Russia-Ukraine situation and what we're seeing in terms of the importance of having some energy independence. And I'd love your thoughts. You know, the president's been out recently about taxing the oil companies more for their excess profits. But more importantly, I guess, how do you see the impact of the ongoing war in terms of the global energy picture and what we need to do in terms of investments over the next 3 to 5 plus 20 years?
I think Europe's in for a tough winter. That's what we get from the briefings that we take. And at the same time, I think Zelensky is an inspiration to man and womankind. When this started 7.5 months ago, nobody gave the Ukrainians a chance. Right now, looks like the Ukrainians can win this, or at least a stalemate. When you consider the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they're arming. They don't want to go back to Soviet or Russian domination. How about the idea that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO? They know what this means. You know, 3 cheers for the Poles and the Romanians. They don't want to go back to the Iron Curtain, Soviets telling them what they have to do every day. There's a ferocious sense of independence. They're happy to be away from them. And my sense is if we can get everybody through this winter, and America's, look, we're at $66 billion, we're going to have to keep it up. I think the Ukrainians have to win this. And I hope that all of you, despite whatever you come across, standing with the Ukrainians is the honorable thing to do right now in American history.
All right. Well, as always, Chairman, thank you for your thoughtful comments and for being here with us. It's always so informative, and we really appreciate your service and for representing us so well in Washington and all you do to try and bring legislation to the table. So keep up the great work as hard as it is, and thank you for being here with us.